thanks to all of you for coming. And omlouvám se těm, kteří by třeba preferovali češtinu, ale z různých důvodů jsem zvolil angličtinu. So from now on I'll speak English, but kdybyste chtěli v diskuzi klást otázky v češtině, to bude úplně v pořádku. But now into English and into the field of Anglophone, specifically North American, specifically US literature. But with a couple of disclaimers that I think might be interesting. The first is that, as Anya mentioned in the introduction, literature is not my main field of study. So my main field of study is social theory, and I deal with narrative theory and folklore, in other words, stories and society. And so I come to literature in that sense from the outside, and I'm interested in how literature can be, or maybe must be, as I would argue, outside itself, in order to be interesting as literature. So that's one side of the disclaimer. The other side is that my area of scholarly specialization is in East Central European culture, not US literature. But in US literature, I am something of an unwilling participant, willing as writing, but not so much voluntarily a writer within the US field of literature. But it's a field that I haven't managed to escape. And in the process of my failed attempts to escape from the field of US literature, over the years I've been writing up notes, complaints, grievances against this field with the idea that someday I would turn it into a paper. So when Anya organized this lecture series, I thought this is the chance for me to finally get back to that project. And so that, in the end, I've been focusing so much on the situation of US literature that I haven't actually gotten as much into the situation in East Central Europe as I think the lecture description might have seemed to promise. But this East Central European literature is on my mind this whole time. I'm looking at the United States in some sense from this vantage point of being here, of looking at what happened to East Central European literature after 1989, of some trends that I think paralleled what happened in the United States after World War II, and which I see as maybe a warning to the literature of this region. So now I'll get into the paper proper. Something quite strange to my way of seeing emerged in the United States starting roughly in 1945. The idea that we should measure the value of writing by how much it is good writing. You might not think that's so strange. Who could be against good writing? The more I read good writing, though, the more I'm convinced that the blind faith in something called good writing has made mainstream US literary fiction into one of the most boring bodies of literature in the contemporary world. In a situation where, I don't mean this as a simple insult of this literary field in which I play a very tiny part, but the strange paradox that it's emerged, in which I would argue that there's never been a civilization where so many people write literature and yet so few people care about it. Where there's so much literature that's quite well written, and yet so little that if we consider how many books there are in the world, and we have to choose only a few, so little of that well-written literature is what some of us who aren't immersed in that field might consider worth reading. So let me explain what I mean with a detour, which also will show you how long I've been milling this idea for a paper about in my head. In the year 2008, Horace Engdahl, who was then the head jurist of the Nobel Committee for Literature, commented that, quote, "The US is too insulated, too insular. They don't translate enough and don't really participate in the big dialogue of literature." At this point in 2008, the last time a US writer had won the Nobel Prize in Literature was when Toni Morrison won it in 1993. Given that there are many countries in the world, it's not perhaps a tragedy that one country didn't get it for a few years. But there's something interesting that emerged from the controversy and the debate that came after this. The reaction of the US literary establishment was, maybe not surprisingly, not everyone took the insult kindly. The head of the US National Book Foundation offered to send Engdahl a reading list of all of the good books that actually exist in the United States. I think that he, in some ways, proved Engdahl's point by saying this, as if he expected that Engdahl would be convinced by seeing that, in fact, there were quite a few good books written in the United States. But Engdahl had never claimed that there weren't good books written in the United States. The problem was precisely that the US writing establishment was satisfied with the quality of its books and didn't consider it important to participate in any big dialogue of literature. It considered its role in the dialogue to consist in sending out good books for others to read. Now, a few of the US-based commentators did respond more sympathetically to Engdahl's comment. They admitted that the US literary scene really was too insular, that really should translate more literature from abroad. But this response overlooked a more profound source of isolation. The US literary establishment, as I see it, is not just isolated from the literature of other countries. It's above all isolated from its own country. It doesn't engage the social world around it at home enough, much less the world that it glimpses when, on occasion, it reads works imported from abroad. That was 2008. Since then, the US has actually won 2 more Nobel Prizes for literature, neither of them, however, in the field of fiction. Bob Dylan, 2016, Louise Gluck, poet, in 2020. Again, the US is one of many countries. There are only so many Nobel Prizes to go around. That shouldn't be the point, despite the fact that the US does enjoy enormous advantages on the world literary market, advantages of political power, economic power, publicity, etc. But what is interesting is that the Nobel Committee, which I don't consider in any way an adequate arbiter of literary quality, nevertheless seems to register that literary quality, as perceived by a broader public, should involve something bigger than good books, than just good writing. So implicitly, what Engdahl seemed to have been saying is that good writing in isolation is not enough. Good writing is not universally and abstractly good, floating freely in an unregulated market of goods, waiting for consumers to choose from among them according to some kind of perfect access to information about book quality. What I would say is that the big dialogue of literature is not only a dialogue among books or literary magazines, but should be a dialogue between literature and society. And so for US literature to become important as literature, it wouldn't just be enough to integrate itself into the bigger literary world, but would have to confront its own social world to be where it is when it reaches towards everywhere else. But what then is this kind of good writing that I've been talking about? I want to start answering that by turning to what editors have to say. And for this, I would turn to a specific subcategory of editors, not the editors of books, because by the time an author is able to be published, to have a novel, for example, or a collection of poetry published, by that point, especially in the case of novels, authors have already been pre-filtered by agents, and especially by their ability to have already published in literary journals, gaining them the attention of an agent, or for those who are lucky enough to get published without an agent, gaining the attention of some publisher. So it's the literary journals that really are the meeting point between the vast majority of writers in the United States and the publishers that eventually select a few of them to be read. Most prose authors dream of publishing novels. It's true. This is still the dream. But the best, and for many the only way to get a novel published, is to start with these journals, and this means practically sending out manuscripts to many different journals in the hopes of getting one story published in one place. The US literary world has become so big, and I'll get back to this later, that the quantity of submissions to any single journal is just far outweighs the quantity of the ability of those journals to even read everything submitted, much less to select the very best writing from all that. So one would think one reasonable response to that for the writer would be to choose those journals that best align with that writer's style, that writer's commitment to kind of social engagement, for what thing the writer wants to do with their writing. But this is what the writer will then find when the writer goes to look at the different literary journals to decide where to submit something. I'll read a very typical kind of explanation from some journals about what kind of writing they're looking for. I quote now from the self-description of the journal, New Letters. It says, "Our only fixed requirement is good writing." Now, the Iowa Review, which is one of the leading journals in the country, it says, "The Iowa Review's mission is to serve the reading public by presenting the best contemporary writing in short fiction, poetry, and creative nonfiction." The best contemporary writing. Now, the Chicago Review, where, full disclosure, I briefly served on their fiction editorial board a long time ago. The Chicago Review publishes a range of contemporary poetry, fiction, and criticism. A range. The mission of the New England Review is to publish the most provoking and rewarding writing of our time. We publish poetry and fiction in a variety of shapes and styles. Or there's one journal that took this to the next level and contained its criterion in the journal's subtitle itself. It's a journal called Compose, a journal of simply good writing. And so on and so on. We can find journals that publish, for example, speculative fiction, fantasy. I'm sure there are romance fiction journals out there. But if those journals, the vast majority of those journals that claim to be doing serious literary publishing, they over and over say that they publish good writing, simply good writing, a range of good writing, the best writing. Some of them will then, if you read farther in their self-description, they will tell readers, well, they'll admit that they do have their own style It's a little bit hard to describe what our style is, but the best way to understand is to buy a couple of issues and read them, and that will give you a sense. Considering that the average writer who isn't already established might have to be sending every story to 20, 30 journals before getting published, that's a pretty tall order to buy a couple of issues from 20, 30, 50 journals and read them all to get a sense of how different they are, because they can't explain their differences themselves. On top of that, the journals' names are also just as nondescript. The most typical formula is the X review, usually with a place name or a university name. In preparing for this lecture, I just randomly selected a few US states where I wasn't sure if there was a journal of that name, and in every case there was an Arkansas review or a Georgia review and so on. And many of them are, at least call themselves top quality reviews, and in the sense that they probably select only a very small percentage of what is submitted, and they publish some of the leading writers in the country, such as the kind of the weight of publishers of short fiction versus the amount of production of short fiction that can't get published, that every place has an important journal, and yet they're all nondescript in some way. Or it's very difficult, or they can't explain what is other than nondescript about them. And sometimes, as in the interesting case of the Minnesota review, even the nondescript name is actually not accurate. The Minnesota review is published in Virginia because the editor at some point left Minnesota and went to a different university, and then another editor took it over. It went from North Carolina, and then it ended up, I think, after a couple more moves in Virginia, and so on. And in some cases, even journal rules prohibit local writers, like university students and employees, from publishing in their own institution's journal. So they're effectively applying the principle of a kind of blind review, or an anonymous kind of connection between the literary production and the literary publishing. But this belies the fact that actually almost everyone who is published, because it's so selective, almost everyone who is actually published needs to already be somewhat known. And I'm going off script a little bit, but when I was an editor of the Chicago Review, we would get piles of, for every issue, maybe 2,000 stories submitted. Maybe 1,000, I don't remember. I served on the board for about 2 years, a few issues, let's say. And even though we went through everything that we received, we tried to read the cover letter or the first few paragraphs of everything, we selected a few of the stories that seemed good to us as the fiction staff. In the end, none of those were actually published because the editors over us in the journal decided that some more prominent writers whose names were already well known had written something better, and they were the ones published in those issues anyway. So this is just a bit of an ethnographic insights to how this, let's say, the bottom of the US literary world functions, and this like initial gatekeeping moment, how it functions. This kind of anonymity is presented as if it were fair, instead of having a process where if we look at literary history, there's an open non-anonymity. There's an open declaration that X journal represents certain collaborators, a certain group, a certain school, a certain political project, for example. Here, that is all removed, and what we have are this idea of fair, just evaluation, where the disconnect between what the authors think they can do or want to do with their work, and what the publishers think they want to do with the work. As if that were unimportant, the important thing is the fair evaluation of quality of writing. All of this might also lead one to ask why we should bother reading any of these countless, probably thousands of lesser-known journals that print good literature, when we could instead be reading better literature published in the New Yorker or the Atlantic or Harper's. If there's not really any other difference other than good versus bad writing, then why not just focus on the very best? What need do we have for all these other journals out there? So this historical variety of different possible literary positions and attitudes seems to be reduced to a single continuum between the best and most selective down to those somewhat less selective, but still pretty selective, down to the next level of all the writing that gets done and isn't published, to which I'll get in a moment. But first, a little bit of let's say, a historical excursus into the notion of good writing. As far as I know, no history of this idea has been written, but a little bit of a speculative history is what I'll try to give now. What seems clear to me is that it is something of a historical novelty, this idea that something called good writing exists. In the ancient and medieval worlds, there were great poets, great playwrights, great philosophers, great preachers and orators. There were skilled scribes, there were learned men, but there were not good writers as such. Each category of verbal art was evaluated in its own terms, and the connection with the specific, in connection with the specific social meaning of the given category. So an epic poet would not be placed on the same continuum with a dramatist or a philosopher. Their genres of practice could be compared as wholes. So Plato could argue that philosophers were superior to poets because they were devoted to truth. Aristotle could argue that tragedy was superior to epic because of its tight structure and efficiency of effect. But neither would argue that Heraclitus or Aeschylus was a better writer than Homer or Pindar. There were different categories. Writing itself was seen as a technology or medium through which other arts could be expressed. And it was also, insofar it was an art of its own. Writing was an art, but a visual art, something that one could physically learn to do, and not everyone knew how to do physically. Not everyone understood the technology of reading, but this was not this. It wasn't a verbal art in the sense that it came to be known later. There was no inherent overlapping between the various verbal arts, or what Aristotle called poetica, and the category of writing, which included everything written down, whether artistic or utilitarian. But something began to change in the modern period. There did gradually emerge a notion of literature that referred not just to anything written, but to a kind of writing with a certain aesthetic purpose and quality, which might be called good or beautiful, rendered in French as belles lettres. So this meant simultaneously narrowing the notion of writing to focus on the aesthetic and broadening out from the many separate literary genres that had already existed. Once there existed belles lettres in general, it became possible to compare the writers of different genres. So, and the category of the writer as such could emerge. Someone who sought mastery not just of one genre or another, but of the craft of writing, not the physical craft of writing things down, but the craft of composing works with words. And in time, writers came to be evaluated within a single literary field. They could be given prizes for their contribution, not to just tragic drama or lyric verse, for example, but to literature as such. Their individual works could now be evaluated independently of the genres in which they emerged. And eventually, there would emerge this idea that there was a kind of high literature out there that floated above genres, while genres became associated with low popular writing. And finally, it became possible to evaluate the quality of good writing separately from the social context in which it emerged. So good writing wasn't about what verbal artists did with their work in a certain place and time. For example, how successfully their love poems persuaded their objects of admiration, how effectively their epics raised public pride or indignation over the narrated events, how sermons tore at the hearts of their listeners, and so on. But the works could be evaluated in terms of by what they were. Works could be good or bad outside of society. They could speak to something that was supposed to be universal and timeless. Still, for a long time, this tendency remained one of many tendencies within literary history that was counterbalanced by the intensely social uses to which 19th and 20th century literature was often put. So epic would be revived as a social claim on national history, lyric revived as a vector of personal revolt against moral strictures and of collective protest against oppression. Drama was given the task of displaying social tendencies that could fight it out on stage. The good writer was expected to make use of these generic tools to do the social work that made it possible to see how good writing was. And even if there emerged this idea that writing could be universal, that could exist beyond time, at the same time, the writers that were evaluated as being great happened to be those who had contributed to some historical moment in some remarkable way. And even when the autonomy of art and literature was ostentatiously declared in variations on the slogan of art for art's sake, or poetry in itself, and so on, this represented its own form of social engagement, a kind of protest against dull and oppressive worldliness, next to which literature could be its own cause. So what I'm going to talk about now is what happened in the United States, especially in the years following World War II, where something qualitatively new took place. One significant source is a special supplement of Harper's Magazine published in 1959 called Writing in America. It's one of many sources one could look at, but it's quite telling in how it called together some of the most prominent US and a few British writers of that moment to comment on what had happened to American literature over the past few years. And already then they identified what I would consider to be still the chief characteristics of US literary fiction today. For example, theater critic Robert Brustein observed that, quote, "One of the unique features of post-war American drama is its cheerful isolation from a central literary tradition. A successful playwright today may think of himself as a craftsman, an entertainer, even a creative artist, but only in very rare cases would he call himself a literary man." So already he's beginning to talk about writing as a craft, drawing away from what of literary tradition of contributing to something, of literature doing something, while at the same time he attributes theatrical writing to something closer to what would become genre fiction in the United States, distinct from what he thinks of as the literary tradition. So literary men, as he says, are the ones who write in the other genres, and the playwrights have turned into people who just do entertainment. But this rise in craft at the expense of literary meaning was also observed in novels and literary fiction by literary critic Alfred Kazin in the same supplement to Harper's. He says, "Well, I see a host of brilliantly talented writers all around me. I don't often get a very profound satisfaction out of the novels they write." And for him, what he identifies as what's missing is essentially the social meaning of literature. Whereas in his comparison, pre-war literature, in pre-war literature, the protagonist would struggle against social enemies who were honestly opposed to the protagonist's demand of unlimited freedom. Now, in what he calls the age of psychological man, we get novels in which society is a mere backdrop to the aloneness of the hero. Whereas now he compares to the 19th century. In the 19th century, the person of the novel was a character, and now that character has become a problem. The novel becomes not a series of actions which the character initiates because of who he is, but a series of disclosures, as at a psychoanalyst's, designed to afford him the knowledge that may heal him. For me, the issue is not that psychological interiority became material for literature. That in itself was nothing new. The issue is that interiority became the goal of writing. At an earlier moment, and I would also add it in other literary locations, psychology was explored in order to comment on society, to protest against restrictions, to reflect on universal human conundrums, and so on. Now individual psychology became what good writing was supposed to be about. Society could serve as literary material, but US literature's endpoint was characters in their inexorable particularity. As if by turning away from grand social forces to the microscopy of individual lives, the literary craft could now be refined without undue distraction. And there was another factor observed in the same issue of Harper's by the British writer C.P. Snow. Looking at America, he says, in England, we know who our audience is. We know our audience. In America, the writers really don't know whom they're writing for. The literary world has simply become too big. One might reasonably object to this, that the expansion of readership was a good in itself, outweighing all the challenges it might bring. But this only holds true if we assume that any country's reading public, or more precisely, the readership of respected literary literature in any country, is an undifferentiated whole. This is precisely what changed in the course of 20th century US literature, and what distinguishes the US from other literary locales. When literature develops in multiple genres or styles or tendencies, its public becomes more manageable. Authors might know whom they are writing for. But if there is only good writing, and every respected journal and every respected publishing house addresses all of the writers of good writing, then any writer is bound to be lost in a public so big as that. A smaller, let's say, smaller national language might have the advantage that it, even by focusing on good literature and losing these other distinctions, it still can't get too big. But that doesn't condemn Anglophone writing to be too big. But there's one more thing mentioned in this Harper's supplement, Writing in America, that's a key piece of the puzzle that I should also address. That's the rise in the post-war US of something called creative writing. Also a new concept, and in some countries still a new concept. Now, what happened is masses of unpublished individuals, not filtered by talent or qualification or connection to the literary establishment, were encouraged to write, not with the end of being published, but with the end of developing and expressing their own creativity. And as popular practice, this was a truly emancipatory tendency, and especially in a situation where it's this large literary field where the vast majority of people who might potentially want to be writers cannot be published. This is maybe a reasonable response to say we're not writing in order to get published. Writing is about you. It's about expressing yourself. As popular practice, there's a lot to be said for it. As a means of teaching people to write, it also has less emancipatory implications for the course of US literature. And as a means of cultivating individual creativity, so it was a boon to hundreds of thousands of people who could then, thanks to these workshops, writing programs, writers groups, they could become writers without needing to be published and widely read. But as a means of producing collectively read literature, I'm afraid that it's not so one-sidedly positive as a tendency. And not because I don't think creative writing can be taught. That's something that's often put out as a criticism of this idea of creative writing workshops. I consider that claim to be as both true and pointless. Philosophy can't be taught, art can't be taught, and yet they've been taught for thousands of years. They wouldn't be produced the way they are with such dexterity and such intensity if we didn't make a concerted effort to help people learn for themselves how to write. But the point is how. It's constructive, I think, to compare different ways that one might become a writer in different societies. One way, for centuries, those who dedicated themselves to verbal art were typically immersed in a specific genre of expressive culture, and they came to desire the honors of mastering it. They might want to become a popular village songwriter or a great court poet. And the artist here would create work in a direct interaction with the public, winning or losing favor, flattering or provoking it, gaining laurels or being banished. This is one way. Now, in the 18th and 19th centuries, throughout the world, and it's now at this moment becoming possible to speak of a world literature as more and more communities acquire the consciousness that they should have their own literature in this world, there emerges this new way of becoming a writer. A person who senses the challenge of a historical moment, feels that great human problems can be addressed in the art of words, might take up the pen or the keyboard and struggle through this material of words to answer this call. People would become writers by hearing the call of a social movement or a national project or the cause of beauty against worldly ugliness. And being a writer then was a way of doing something in the world, even if it was doing something against that world. And now we can compare that with the attitude of the creative writer. The creative writer is a person who feels an inner need to express something and is given tools for expression. This inner need then finds its way onto the page. The goal of creativity then has been met in a relationship between the writer and the page, though it likely passes through a few other individuals along the way. They might be members of workshops or writers' groups. The goal of writing, though, can be met in isolation from the world. According to Eric Bennett, who's both a novelist and a scholar of writing workshops, he says this was no accidental development, but was actually a concerted development in line with Cold War politics, during which the CIA and State Department funded creative writing just as they were funding modern art. And for example, Paul Engel, who was the director of the Iowa Writers' Workshop, which is one of the oldest and remains probably the most prestigious writers' workshop in the United States, he presented creative writing as a tool in the cultural war against fascism and communism, because he believed creative writing could oppose collectivism by the singular, the personal, the anomalous, and the particular. That's a quote from Bennett, not from Engel directly, but this is Bennett's interpretation of Engel. Now, this in itself was a kind of engaged writing, a political program, writing given social purpose by its opposition to one political attitude and its preference for another. And if it had continued in this way, maintaining its and acknowledging its tendential character, if this type of writing developed as one school against other schools, there could have been these, let's say, particularist, democratic, anti-collectivist schools against the more socially oriented schools that could have continued what had been done in the interwar period. If that had been the case, U.S. writing might have preserved its connection to society, even in its turning away from society. In a way, this is what all literature, all effective literature does. It turns away from the problems of the world in order to address them indirectly. But the crucial turn, in my view, came when these creative writing programs stopped declaring it to be their mission to promote one kind of writing, promote writing that does something, that has some effect in the world, against other kinds of writing that might have other effects. And they began to present themselves simply as places to learn how to write well. In this, they were maybe consistent with a certain attitude of the Cold War, which was a peculiar war in which in time became less about promoting one civilization or way of life over another, and became more about promoting fundamental human truth, like the individual, freedom, democracy, the free market as natural phenomena that didn't need cultivation, but only protection from artificial encroachment. So it wasn't a war of one society against another, but a kind of war of the universal individual against society as such. As Bennett observes, the first creative writing programs developed a model that valued the interior and private life of the individual, whose experiences are not determined by any community, ideology, or political system. They privileged the particular over the universal, the sensory over the ideational, the concrete over the abstract. And so in this context, we arrive at the kinds of advice to writers that come up in every standard creative writing workshop, or now YouTube video, I suppose. Phrases like, find your voice, write what you know, show, don't tell. Not, for example, what could have also been said, join a current of voices, say something to someone, write through the problems that face us, but whose answers we don't know. When we're taught to show and not tell in writing, this in itself, it's at a most generous level, it's good advice, but it's also bad advice if taken to an extreme. The most interesting literature also tells a great deal. Think of the great works of Voltaire, Hugo, Tolstoy, Kundera as a more questionable but more recent example. It does tell something. It tells many things, but it tells them indirectly. It tells you one thing in order to mean something else. It tells things askance. But this means you have to not just show, because you have to learn how to tell, but tell in an interesting way. Tell in a way that unfolds indirectly and through story, or through poetry. And by saying that writers should show, not tell, when this turned into a kind of not just let's say relative and piece of advice to be discussed, but became a kind of commandment to writers, it was as if writers lost their license to say anything of significance at all. Then, in addition to this, creative writing will come up with a long list of clever rules like tell readers what the characters are thinking, keep telling us more and more. Don't use adverbs because the same thing can be described more compellingly without them. Start your story close to the end and then go back. These are all, again, possibly good advice. But why is it this kind of advice that's being given to authors? Not advice that would say, for example, tell authors to explore their place in literary history or explore their place in the world. Not ask them what they want to do with their writing. One result is that already the first generation of post-war writers, which included thousands of soldiers who were filling the universities coming back from the front, and then again a new wave of writers after the Vietnam War, their writing was desocialized, and in another study of the literary fiction creative writing programs by Mark McGurl, he observes that war writing, precisely after the war, and then again after the Vietnam War, when so many writers had experienced war writing as a genre actually declined, replaced with something that he calls veteran American writing. In other words, the war is not experienced, it's not portrayed as stories. Literature about the war is no longer literature that tells stories of great geopolitical tendencies or clashing of societies, but tells an experience of a cultural minority, veterans as a cultural minority to be placed alongside other minorities. And so then any kind of experience in this model could be written about. Politics could enter literature, society could enter literature, anything could enter literature, but on the condition that it enters as this individualized experience. And some kind of collectivity could be achieved by then moving out again from individual experience to something like identity, but not telling the kind of story of social forces in motion that we might have had in a different literary form. And meanwhile, all of this took place while the institution of writing in the United States became increasingly ensconced in universities, leaving the more properly public sphere where writing had previously and in many other countries was much more still at home. So learning to write was becoming something that it was becoming a part of being educated, something that an individual might do for self-improvement, but not something that a person might do to speak to the world. It was only logical that in such an environment, the vast array of historical genres that were once accepted as literary would reduce towards zero. If in writing literary history, we accept both the medieval romance and the Buddhist parallel as literary, post-war US fiction would be divided into categories of literary versus genre fiction. Well, whatever conformed to a genre was no longer considered properly literary, and whatever was considered literary was no longer recognized as conforming to conventions of genre. There was no problem with medieval romance conforming to genre in the past, but now if there's genre conventions are recognized, that means the literary quality of the work has to be taken away. The fiction about this idea of fiction is that all good fiction writing should be considered literary fiction, as if it were all freed from the strictures of genre, which then doesn't enable us to explain the enormous uniformity of the actual production of literary fiction. So, while great fantasy or mystery writing rarely makes it onto the pages of literary journals, there are only a few exceptions. And while this is a hypothetical, but I I would guess that if the works of Calvino and Garcia Marquez had been submitted in English as if they were written by unknown Anglophone authors, they would have been pigeonholed into the genre of speculative fiction in their period, not evaluated as literary fiction. I would also speculate that if Shakespeare or Wordsworth submitted their works today, they wouldn't be accepted to contemporary literary journals. And there might be good reasons for this. These writers might seem out of touch. They're not addressing the problems of their context and moment. But if the journals claim to publish only abstractly good writing, what justification do they have for selecting only some writing that looks more or less always the same? I'm exaggerating, but only a little bit. Now, when fantasy and romance and mystery novels resemble one another, they do so deliberately. They recognize these generic conventions as part of what they're trying to do. They fulfill some of readers' expectations while surprising them in carefully selected ways. If you're a good writer of this genre fiction, you know what you play with what the readers expect. You give them something, you surprise them in some other way. But if you're writing literary fiction, and it seems to be very similar to other literary fiction, it's as if it has to be accidental. There's no justification for it because it is not allowed to acknowledge any convention of genre. Now, how did it come to be unliterary to work in genres? Well, it became literary to ignore the fact that is acknowledged by almost any contemporary literary scholar, the fact that all writing involves convention and genre and form that we inherit from previous writers. But the result is a field that's divided in these two halves. One half that cares about genre as a value in itself. Genre fiction is supposedly about the genre. Well, literary fiction should be about something else. But what is it about? If it's not about genre, it would be logical for literary fiction to be about life, about the world, about something outside of genre. But at the same time, it rejects, in this post-war period, it rejects this connection to the outside world, or it rejects this active connection. It rejects this playing a role in the world. And as a result, what is called literary fiction actually plays the part of, does what genre fiction does, because it's fiction that is about being good writing, that it becomes self-referential, becomes more about craft than about world, and becomes, in a sense, the kind of essence of kitsch that it's trying to negate. Kitsch, on the other hand, is about art. Kitsch is art that's not about the world, but is only about showing you that it is something that it claims to be, that it is art. That it denies itself by claiming to be this art that it can't quite be. Literary fiction, then, in the sense of good writing that I've been talking about, I think is self-defeating. Whereas genre fiction is a matter of craft, being self-contained, literary fiction needs to be more than craft, needs to be about the world, and yet it rejects this connection to the world. Well, at the same time, and this is one of the strange paradoxes of the genre that denies its being a genre, it also denies its social engagement with the world, while at the same time claiming to be realist. The hegemonic post-war US literary style is indeed called realism, despite the fact that it has little in common with earlier realist traditions, which made it their mission to show social forces unfolding in stories. It's called realism primarily I think because it presents itself as the negation of the fantastical and the unbelievable elements that are so prominent in genre fiction. But it's just as much a negation of earlier forms of social realism, that earlier forms, let's say, and the contemporary post-war forms of socialist realism that in the Cold War context were also a foil. And so there emerged some kind of asocial realism, or I might call it an ordinary realism, that takes reality to be accurately represented only when it focuses on the minutiae of everyday individual experience. Which isn't to say that extraordinary pain or trauma or suffering don't play roles in this genre, but they appear not as great events, but as slowly lived experience. We have the emergence of value of slice of life moments rather than grand narratives, description that doesn't engage too much, shock perhaps, but shows the ugly, while ironically distancing the narrator from the subject, style before subject, prose before plot, character before events, the voice of the author before voice coming from society. And this denial of convention that also enables authors to present their work as if it were universal in a kind of unmediated way, because there being no convention, it is as if the author were simply writing directly to be universal, to say something about not a specific social world, but about humanity and the universe in general. And yet at the same time it does this only through very ultra particular experience. And now, to be fair, I can see how at a certain moment at the end of World War II, let's say, a few decades of socially engaged realism had been alternating with modernist experimentalism, and it might have felt a bit old. In that context, if I place myself there, I can see how the demand for a retreat into particularity, everyday life, the ordinary, might itself represent a kind of rebellion. But the thing that makes it problematic is not that it emerged once, not that it emerged as one attitude among many, but that it emerged and remained the dominant way of writing without acknowledging its particularity as a way of writing among other kinds of writing, and that it remained in this situation for what's now 80 years. So I will now move to a conclusion and briefly say a few words about what I have left out of this, which is all those things that have been written that don't fit into this, what I call the dominant form of ordinary realist, post-war US fiction. And the fact that I think there may be a shift taking place in the last few years in this literary field. And then I'll point to the situation here, and maybe that we can discuss that more after I finish. Now, so over the course of these now 8 decades, we have seen various attempts to write social novels that have been significant. Norman Mailer, for example, Thomas Wolfe, maybe more recently Jonathan Franzen. They've come out with attempts to write something that was more of like 19th century style social novel. They haven't become dominant, but they've done something that in retrospect could be seen as harbingers of future revival. There was also the postmodern novel and story tradition that's played that loved with play and story and experimenting with form, that was able in some contexts, at some moments, to break its way into recognition as literary fiction, despite the fact that it didn't conform to the realist hegemony. And of course, there's the magical realism of writers like Toni Morrison, which never became dominant, and in some ways, strangely, she could get a Nobel Prize, but there's no like literary journal that would focus on like Morrison style writing, for example. If you write that way, you still just have to submit either to fantasy journals or to the same journals that otherwise almost only publish realism. And more significantly, I think for the present moment, is writing that has explored the minority experience in the last few years, especially, I think increasingly important. And maybe that's a sign of like breaking up of the old realist hegemony, which I think is remarkable in two ways. It's remarkable both that it's happening, that it's doing something different, that many writers are addressing what it means to be something other than a white male in the United States. But it's also remarkable how this is kind of assimilated by the literary establishment that still understands this as just another exploration of individual experience. These are writers, it's thought of as minority literature rather than thought of as social literature. It's thought of as minority literature because it tells us what this unusual experience is that some people have. These voices that have been excluded are now going to be integrated into the whole, as if the whole didn't have to change. So I'll end with a hope that might change, and a warning about Eastern Europe, which is that I should now shorten what I had planned to say about that, but I thought about starting with this anecdote, which was of many years ago. I think it was around 2000, around the time I started thinking about this. So around 2008, there were three Central Eastern European writers in Chicago giving book talks. Their books had just been translated, and one was Czech, one Hungarian, one Slovenian, and all three of them were faced with this challenge of what to do now that writing has become unnoticed, insignificant in Eastern Europe after 1989. Writing before 89, we weren't free. This was how they all put it in different variations. We weren't free, but everyone cared what we wrote. Now we're free and nobody cares. And one of the older writers both lamented this situation in a sense, but said, well, this is the price we have to pay for freedom. What can we do about it? The younger writer said, actually, maybe this is a good thing. Maybe it's better that we don't have to write socially significant and political literature. We can finally write literature that's universal and pure. At this moment, none of them came with the response that maybe we could make our literature relevant again. And that's the moment where I think both that this was telling of this post 1989 moment when there was I think a certain like feeling of lostness about what it is, what our society is, what we are doing, what literature should do in this region. Literature that has always in Central Eastern Europe always been closely involved and completely immersed in political events, now is supposed to not be anymore. And how can it even survive? And there was, I think, a flirtation with trying to make it pure and individual and universal at the same time in this unmediated way that it is in the United States. And I think since that time it has maybe changed again. But there's this temptation that may be still out there that I would warn against. And that's where I'll end.